topic that he's got for today is that of, I have to shut this down in a moment, is nationalism and the moral implications of nationalism. So, it's appropriate enough to talk about the moral implications of nationalism on January 6th, right? Like this is this is a thing, right? And especially if one wants to, like, it lays bare the issues. I think, like, if part of the idea is, my guess is, again, for the average person listening to this, like a Zionist, you're a nationalist, right? Like there's a sense of like, oh, like nationalism is a good thing. And if you're, and from the perspective of looking back at a year ago today, you see the negative effects of like what happens if a sense of nationalism is steps into ultranationalism. Ultranationalism, again, sort of is like is the reducing of concern for other factors beyond like this strength or the good of the, whatever entity you're talking about, the state, the country, the ethnic group, whatever it might be, right? So, so pluses and minuses. Zionist Jews tend to see nationalism as a good thing, gives the state of Israel. And again, if you look at, people storming the Capitol in the name of making America great. Right, but it's a consequence of it, right? So you can say perversion, but still it's not, whether or not you, we'll see, but though we don't agree, that doesn't mean that there's not a logic going on there. You get what I'm saying? In order to what? In order to reestablish. Yeah. I think that the Make America Great flags indicate that the individual is feeling, or the group is feeling, a nationalist surge, right? Like right, get what I'm saying? Like whether or not you agree, like I'm saying that the person that part of the motivation is a ultra nationalist feeling, right? Right, that's part of the Make America Great. There's a Stop the Steal, whatever it might be. Like there's a sense, like
1776 is something.
Right, or it's 1776, and like but in any event, like it's there's a it plays out like the real consequence of nationalism. Now the other end of it is that there's the opposite side of this thing takes place on the left, where nationalism is seen as negative, right? Especially because of the association with Trump and Trumpism, right? And this sort of we touched on last time, that because nationalism tends to be the domain of the stronger on the right, then there's a reaction on the left of, well, if they're that, then I'm not that, right? So that plays out. And it actually reminded me, especially this week, I was thinking about Jonathan Haidt, who's a moral psychologist at the University of Virginia who writes a lot on these things. He wrote in 2012, 2013, something like this, he wrote The Righteous Mind, Why Liberals and Conservatives Don't Agree on Things. And it's worth, and I want to just throw this in by way of introduction, because it was definitely on my mind. It definitely it helps me understand things. He speaks about giving surveys, and I could give you the survey as well, like the of what of moral decision making, and people who consider themselves liberals and people who consider themselves conservatives consistently across cultures give similar responses to decision making, meaning that liberals across cultures tend to give have one moral decision making matrix, and conservatives tend to have a different moral decision-making matrix, which is to say that everyone agrees that questions of harm and not harm are moral concerns, and questions of fairness are moral concerns, right? That things should be fair, and that you should, that there should be a degree of preventing harm, right? What is harm and what is fairness, people can argue about, but that those are moral concerns is agreed upon across the board. But time after time after time, people who identify as liberal tend not to say, tend to have those as the moral concerns, period. And people who are conservative consistently will add in aspects of respect for authority, respect for sanctity, something that is sacred or with a touch of the divine, and a sense of loyalty to the in-group, to whatever group you're a part of. And that those aren't just nice things, but those are moral values, right? Something that's not a moral value. I don't know, if you like the Yankees uniforms more than the Mets uniforms, like you might have an opinion on that, but no one argues that that's a moral value. That's just a preference. It's not significant. But consistently, conservatives will say that respect for authority, in-group loyalty, and respecting sanctity is a moral concern that rates with, even if it's not essentially equal to, but like sort of is in the moral matrix, along with harm and fairness. So I say that when you think of nationalism, especially like in a Jewish context, and especially sort of like as people like wring their hands, and especially as certain groups of Jews wring their hands over like, will future generations of Jews like still have like a sense of loyalty to Israel or something like this? There's a liberal conservative thing going on, which is to say that liberal Western university educated types tend to score very low on considering respect for authority and in-group loyalty and a sense of the sacred as being a moral virtue. And people who are more conservative tend to have that as moral virtue, meaning that it is, so hate would do something like ask people in surveys. Let's say that Cindy has she lives alone. She has an old American flag in her house. It's been in the closet for years. It's just been collecting dust, and she's sitting home. She's been home for a while, and she lives alone, and she doesn't want it. It's just taking up space. And she's out of paper towels. Doesn't feel like going out. It's a snowstorm, and so nobody sees her. But she decides that it's stupid to let this go to waste. She cuts up the flag into small pieces and uses it as a rag to clean the toilet in her bathroom. Throws it away. Nobody knows, nobody sees it. She never tells anyone. Is there a moral problem with this? It's material. But it's the flag. But so what? So what? Because it's a piece of material. It's just a piece of material. If that were the case, why would I not tell her? She knows somebody else might be hurt by, like it's not about, I don't need any trouble. Somebody else might be offended, but I'm not gonna, right? I don't tell you what rag I use to clean the toilet. It's sort of important. It's important because you could get a moral concern if you say that, well, somebody saw it and they were offended. Then suddenly it's like, well, I'm causing harm. I'm causing offense to somebody. So like this sort of like not telling anyone is like part of it to make sure. So Westerners with a liberal bent tend to give this answer, which is a version of nobody got hurt. Nobody's harmed. Somebody who tends to be more conservative will say there's something essentially sacred about this, and that's not a proper use of that thing. that there's a moral concern for it. Jews you could roll in a siddur or something like this, right? Is this just a preference? Is this a simple preference? Like, I like the Yankees uniforms more than I like the Mets uniforms? Or is this something that is like an actual moral concern? Well, not a moral concern the conservatives a year ago today, though. Again, like, so from, I mean, that obviously not all conservative, but like that, but so play that out. Respect for authority. Well, that's sort of like, that's right, respect, right, there's right, so respect for authority, though the question then is weird, though that's part of the shocking thing about a year ago today is that normally the respect for authority plays itself out in conservative circles, specifically in affection for law enforcement. And certainly we've seen over, especially the last 18 months, like this sort of like that one side flies thin blue line American flags, and another side, at the other end of the spectrum, not so respect for police is a different sort of thing, or defund the police, whatever it might be like. So like, notice that, so that's where the authority line plays out. Phyllis. Right. Right. So is the flag right? Is it something sacred that should be held, that should be respected, or not? And so like all this, so like those so those things.
Would you feel differently if it was the Bologna?
You feel differently. Right. You feel differently about the flag of Fredonia or the flag of Israel. Right. Like what's and the same is true for in-group loyalty, which is to say conservatives tend to feel that prioritizing, this is the nationalism angle, that prioritizing the well-being of the in-group is a moral vector, and liberals less so. The more global or nationalist as opposed to globalist, right? And sanctity, a sense of something being sacred, right? And this is why some of these debates are over flag burning, or can I have should a taxpayer-funded art museum have a art piece of the Virgin Mary smeared with elephant dung, or a cross in a jar of urine, if you remember these debates from back in the day, right? Like, so for one, there's nothing inherently sacred about this, so it's art and it's provocative, or this is something with that there's an inherent sacredness to it, and that so the and you can translate that into Jewish terms of what you feel vis-a-vis a Sefer Torah or whatever the case may be. Right. So anyway, I thought of all this because it's relevant on nationalism issues, and especially I think for non-Orthodox Jews who tend to be not right-wing politically and feel a strong nationalist pull to the state of Israel. So this, I just wanted to bring that in because I think that hates framing. And by the way, he says that five-factor morality that conservatives tend to have, as opposed to the two-factor morality of what of liberals, is what are why disproportionate maybe to what liberals tend to think, why conservatives win elections, meaning that because there are people who will resonate to flag waving and wrapping yourself in the flag and things like this, and respond to it on a moral level. And liberals are less comfortable doing that. It's easier for conservatives, whether it's, Donald Trump or George W. Bush or Ronald Reagan or whoever it might be, that you're essentially at an advantage because that will resonate deeply with people in a way that it's easier for George W. Bush to wrap himself in the flag than for John Kerry, and that's going to swing enough votes. right? Apart from all the other factors of whatever is going on, that this is part of like what can resonate more deeply with people. And I would say, by the way, part of to this last election, Joe Biden almost uniquely can pull off some of those conservative respect sanctity things in a way that some of his younger Democratic Party members can't pull off the same way, right? And likely a factor.
Otherwise, this discussion is ignoring everybody in the middle.
Right.
So, you know, it's another pick and choose.
We got so.
For instance, I consider myself mostly moderate.
Right.
So I wouldn't cut up the American flag and use my toilets, because to me, you know, that would be offensive, but it's a matter of pick and choose. You know, I'll make some decisions that might be considered somewhat liberal and some decisions that might be considered somewhat conservative. And this person that you're quoting seems to just ignore the middle ground.
No. So I don't think there's an actual ignoring the middle ground. I'm giving like the sort of poles of it. It's not like, you know, there's not an actual ignoring of, but I'm citing sort of like the two poles of it. I mean, the middle is sort of like by definition that. So so I'm going to pull up a little bit of like, I read the book, but there's sort of like, he has like a TED Talk summary of it. Make sure, hopefully the volume's up on this. We'll find out, I guess. Let's see if this works. So I'm going to hit play, but I'm going to pause relatively soon.
w.yourmorals.org. And so far, 30,000 people have taken this questionnaire, and you can too. Here are the results. Here are the results from about 23,000 American citizens.
Hold on.
On the left, I've plotted the scores for liberals. On the right, those for conservatives. In the middle, the moderates. The blue line shows you people's responses on the average of all the harm questions. So as you see, people care about harm and care issues. They give high endorsement of these sorts of statements all across the board. But as you also see, liberals care about it.
As soon as I move it to the pause spot,
down.
it disappears.
Same story for fairness.
Right?
But look at the other three lines.
All right, there we go. All right, so the questions, and I can give you the questionnaire. So it's sort of like these questions, like I mentioned before, of like, you know, like what about the person who you know, cuts up a flag? So there's no harm done. But is this did the person do anything wrong? Not, I don't like it, like I don't like the Mets uniform or whatever, but like, is it wrong? And why did this pull out? We lose a signal. That's weird. Technological change is wrong. Nothing. The point is that, I mean, the point on the is that the graph of these things slides from is it there? The graph slides from, let me screen, now I got to go back over here and screen share to the people at home. The slides, like meaning that it goes down in a clear direction of questions of harm. Is somebody harm harmed is this a moral concern is high on for liberals and issues of fairness similarly. But questions that ask about is it right or wrong? Again, not my preference of like, I wouldn't do it, but there's nothing wrong with it. Asking about respect for authority, in-group loyalty, or purity, a sense of sanctity. Like the more that liberals tend not to value these things so much, conservatives do. Like, and that's what, and people who are moderate tend to be in the middle, right? So other questions that you would ask are things like, if the Jones family has a beloved family dog. One day the dog runs out to the front door and gets hit and gets hit by a car and dies. The driver keeps driving. The family takes the dog back inside. They've heard that dog meat tastes good, so they cut up the dog, cook it, eat it. Enjoy it. They decide they might not do it again. They don't tell anyone else. Have they done anything wrong? It's disgusting. You may think it's disgusting. Presumably you think it's disgusting, but have they done anything wrong? Not starving. Not kosher. Is there anything wrong? Morally wrong with this action? There are people in this world who eat dog. Tastes like chicken. So this sort of question is one like this, where people who don't think of sort of like a sense of purity of like that there's a certain, the conservative is more likely to say there's a certain relationship that we have with this. That's the proper order of things. And the well-being of society depends on it. So they're more likely to say that's morally wrong, or to say that the direction of disgust that's morally wrong. Whereas people are more liberal and more likely to say what Muriel says about the flag, which is, I wouldn't do it, but if they want to do it, okay. Right? You see this play out. So, or like another one he has where there's like, oh, if right, severe indigestion, but is that a moral concern? They look up online for good ways to cook dog. Like John every week goes out, buys a chicken, tastes like chicken. Goes out, buys a whole chicken, brings it home, closes the windows, doesn't tell anyone, has sex with the chicken, with the dead chicken, cleans it up, cooks it, eats it. Has he done anything morally wrong? This is exactly, he says, right. So he comes up with them in order to create specifically this. No harm, no physical harm taboos. Each one is a taboo. Nobody is physically hurt. Chicken's already dead. I mean, if you accept the chicken as okay for food, then the only reason why you wouldn't do it is a sense of sanctity. To say that the chicken, the only way you could say the chicken is harm is that the chicken is essentially being disrespected, right? How? The chicken's dead. Well, but then that's a different. Then it's not the unique situation that John does with the chicken. It's the fact that people eat chicken. So the issue there isn't with the specific scenario, it's with the eating of meat. That's something else entirely. Then you wouldn't say that this is the problem, you'd say that that is the problem. No. So as somebody with a moral problem with with humans eating meat. That's not the scenario. So if you say he did something wrong, but the only thing that he did wrong was that he ate meat, then that's something different. You know what I'm saying? So what's the thing that if the thing that he did wrong is that meat consumption is immoral, then that's harm. If the thing that, so what did he do wrong? Then that's harm. If what he did wrong is it's wrong to have sex with chickens, with dead chickens, then that's a purity issue, right? That there's something, that there's essential sacredness to the sexual act, and that this is a degradation of it. So the reason is what's significant there. If the issue is harm, then that's wrong to kill. Then that's one moral matrix. If the issue that it's wrong to do this with a chicken, that's something else. So the moral reasoning is the aspect of it. And what he says is that people most often will say that's wrong, or conservatives often say that wrong, but coming up with a reason tends to be difficult.
If I do something, in privacy in my home and nobody sees it, whoever I have to.
Correct. And is that a moral concern or is it not? So that's the essential question, which is to say that modern Western liberal types, what in the sociology universe they call weird people, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic people live in Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic countries, weird, tend to say a version of what you just said, Alan, which is to say, if it's in the privacy of your own home and nobody is hurt, that's fine. And in non-Western countries, disproportionately, and in fact, like often, like there's a socioeconomic thing in there, like the responses tend to be different, which is to say, what are you talking about? Do you really not understand why it's wrong to do this with a chicken? Right? Westerners are more likely, like again, like sort of like the more educated Western you are, you're more likely to say, well, I guess if that's what he's into, not my thing, but if that's what he's into, there's not a moral concern with that. But in other cultures, and so just the point of this is, by the way, that Westerners that often people only understand two matrices of morality, and other cultures have more matrices of morality.
Isn't it also that the more liberal people tend to say, I might say, I wouldn't do it, but if somebody else wants to, that's fine.
Not for me to judge. Yeah.
But the conservative says, I don't think you should do it, and I will let you do it.
Right, because of this, because there's a sense of, right, so why does the liberal say it's okay, even if I wouldn't do it, but if you want to do it, all right, and the conservative says no, because there's essential sort of, there's a sense of respect, order, divinity. Abortion, same thing plays out. Sexual mores, the same thing definitely plays out. Is there something essentially sacred going on? What is this other one that works? Okay. Jennifer and Ben are siblings. They just finished with college. They're in their early 20s. They're 23 and 25, and Jennifer just finished his college. They go on a backpacking trip around Europe together. They're in a hotel in Switzerland, and they figure, what might be fun? We should have sex. They have sex. They do it one night. They enjoy it. She's already on birth control. He wears a condom. There's really no risk that anyone gets pregnant. And they say, well, it was a new experience, and it was sort of exciting and transgressive, and we don't need to do it again. We're not going to tell anyone about it because people would get upset. But that was nice. Did they do anything wrong? No, because to a weird person, nobody was hurt. This is a harmless taboo. Well, there's a lot of things that we discussed now according to halakha, right? Correct. But this is just it. The one way of conceiving it would say that, well, your halakha is just a series of cultural taboos that really have no moral force. They're acting like they're moral judgments without any moral thing because, well, this is okay. No one was hurt. They do what they feel like doing. I might want to do it, but like, it's not a moral question. So this is whereas somebody with a different set of morality who says that, well, you know, there's a certain, there's something, again, this sort of sense of divinity or purity, that there's something sacred about the sibling relationship, about sexual relationships. It's not just about pursuing your pleasure. Would say that, well, wait a minute, like their actual society depends on certain rules. And if we break those rules, society essentially breaks down and we're going to be in a terrible spot. So these are the kind of things that are worth that again. So I actually do think about this with nationalism because again, many American Jews have the harm and fairness sense of sensibility that these are the moral matrices and nothing else is a moral concern, because if it's between two consenting adults, who am I to say? And others, so have different moral matrices in there, saying that essentially like that, a certain respect for authority, a sense of purity or sacredness, or a sense of the divine being present, something like this is, and sort of loyalty to the in-group, like that there's a moral aspect there too. And Hate's point, by the way, is that this is why people don't understand each other, because some people just don't understand that these things are centrally important, and others don't understand why they're not. If I can get the sound to be on the. Let me see if I can get him to.
This is on the average of all the harm questions. So as you see, people care about harm and care issues. They give high endorsement of these sorts of statements all across the board. But as you also see, liberals care about it a little more than conservatives. The line slopes down. Same story for fairness. But look at the other three lines. For liberals, the scores are very low. Liberals are basically saying, no, this is not morality. In-group authority, this stuff has nothing to do with morality. I reject it. But as people get more conservative, the values rise. We could say that liberals have a kind of a two-channel or two-foundation morality. Conservatives have more of a five-channel morality. We find this in every country we looked at. Here's the data for 1,100 Canadians. I'll just flip through a few other slides. The UK, Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Latin America, the Middle East, the East Asia, and South Asia. Notice also that on all of these graphs, the slope is steeper on in-group authority purity, which shows that within any country, the disagreement isn't over harm and fairness. Everybody, I mean, we debate over what's fair, but everybody agrees that harm and fairness matter. Moral arguments within cultures are especially about issues of in-group authority purity. This effect is so robust that we find it no matter how we ask the question. In one recent study, we asked people to suppose you're about to get a dog, you pick a particular breed, you learn some new information about the breed. Suppose you learn that this particular breed is independent-minded, relates to its owner as a friend and an equal. Well, if you're a liberal, you say, hey, that's great, because liberals like to say, fetch, please. But if you're conservative, that's not so attractive. If you're conservative and you learn that a dog is extremely loyal to its home and family and doesn't warm up quickly to strangers, for conservative, well, loyalty is good. Dogs ought to be loyal. But to a liberal, it sounds like this dog is running for the Republican nomination.
So Hate, of course, say it with me, secular Jew, descended from, good, Russian immigrant socialists from New York, right? So again, the point of that, like in the earlier, it's sort of clear in the earlier things to Sandy's question, which is that people in the middle are in the middle, which is to say, like centrists tend to be in the middle on it. It's like the further left people identify, the further right people identify, the more extreme, and in the middle, which is to say that there'll be sometimes when they'll say that this, even though there's nothing wrong, it's wrong to do, in the incest scenario, whatever the case might be. Libertarians plot in different ways. Like there's really a third matrix of libertarians, but we won't deal with that right now. Anyway, this partly because if you are, again, like for people who tend to value in-group loyalty less as a moral concern, nationalism plays out differently. If really you're supposed to be concerned with all of humanity and not just your group. More conservative one tends to be, the more one is concerned with one's group and seeing it as a moral concern. This plays out in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? Because because ultimately part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the debate, especially in the American Jewish community that takes place over it, is like, how much am I concerned for the out group and how much am I concerned for the in group? How much is Palestinian suffering, which is, sort of like not a matter of opinion, but a factual thing. How much does Palestinian suffering claim my interest and direct my my political decision-making or moral decision-making or tzedakah decision-making, whatever it might be? And how much does the well-being of the state of Israel or Jews in Israel, or whatever the case may be, claim my moral decision-making, right? And you see, sort of like once this idea falls into your lap, like there's I get why liberal campus types will say one thing, because ultimately, if my main concern is whether or not people are being harmed, and less so am I obligated to stand with my group, then, whose life is harder, right? So so you see sort of how these political debates are fed by what I think is moral and what I think is not.
I think before, if I heard you right, you said Republicans have an easier time getting elected.
Well, right, hates sort of literally has a chapter, why Republicans have an easier time getting elected. And it's essentially wrap myself in the flag.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
But my thinking is that the extreme liberal view is more fear than the extreme conservative view. And for example, if we can say, if I'm an extreme liberal, I might say, okay, incest is okay, and you can have sex with your chicken and you can murder your dog, then I can, obviously we don't have too many examples of
Right.
what I want, but if those represent somewhere along the lines of the extreme liberal view, and I think we do hear this in political discourse, at least in this country, then there's more of a fear. You can't really find that strong a parallel on the extreme conservative side.
Right. So let me just summarize what you're saying now for the folks at home. This then then you can finish off like that. That the sort of an extreme sort of permissive permission of like, oh well, if nobody's being harmed, then fine. And ultimately, people like hear you say like, well, whatever, you can have. I guess if you want to have sex with your dog or your chicken or your sibling, like if no harm is coming, then I guess okay, like that well, what it does is it triggers a disgust reflex in people. And, Bob's not getting elected to office, right? Like you come out and you say, well, you can have sex with your sibling, I guess, if you really want to, like you're not winning the election outside of, a couple of safe districts. Right, I was right. Right. And that's the openness. One of the factors is openness to new ideas as opposed to desire for order and consistency. And ultimately, part of this matrix is that especially on a social and political level, if people feel that the order of society is threatened, which means that their well-being is threatened, then they're going to become more conservative and say that, well, wait a minute, I don't know if we should push things that far. So I think it's similar to what you said.
I think that's how Biden got elected.
I think it's totally how Biden got elected. Because for enough people, whether or not an individual, you agree with it or not, like for enough people, he's like seemed like he wasn't going to do something crazy, or that he wasn't going to, he could convincingly speak patriotically. So the order is difficult to maintain, as we know, like and that's the moral argument on the essential, like why are these respect for authority, in-group loyalty, and the sense of purity and divinity, why are these things? Because order is difficult to create and maintain in a society, and its breakdown is always a real risk. That's social entropy. So that's part of why these are felt as moral concerns, that getting rid of them is sort of threatens to bring us into chaos. If everyone's having sex with their sibling, then what the hell is society going to become? Is essentially like what people react on, even if somebody can convincingly argue no harm. So this is because I read books of moral psychology that you get this sort of talk. Back to the Torah. And you would see why conservatives tend to be more religious. Again, well, that's against halakha, as opposed to so his the idea that Hartman really wants to bring here is that the let me I can find the proper let's stop the screen share. Is that the where is my screen? Did I stop the screen share? No, yes, maybe. Is that the sorry, I'm having a hard time finding the right spot on this stuff. There we are. His point is that Judaism seeks a balance of nationalist impulses and universalist globalist impulses, which is to say, the goal is to try and balance these sort of is to try and balance the interests of on one level, if one has no concern for in-group loyalty, then the group dissolves, right? If you actually like don't care about whether or not the well-being of your in-group, then you won't long exist. But if you're only concerned for the well-being of the in-group, then essentially become a fascist, and you don't care about like any harm to anyone else, and the nationalism descends into fascism, right? So Hartman builds his case on this by saying that the essence of where Judaism begins, oddly, is in a respect for life, that a real value in life is pursuit of physical pleasure. That is not a negative thing, as some religious traditions might have it, but that it's a good thing. This begins with, in the first text he brings is, Genesis 2, that in the Garden of Eden, God caused to grow every tree. The V'ismacha Adonai Elohim min adma kol eitz nachmad l'mar'eh v'tov l'ma'achal. That cause to grow every tree pleasing to see, pleasing to the sight, and good for food. And that is this essential sense of physical pleasure. That the Garden of Eden is a place where like you're physically satisfied. It looks good and it tastes good, right? And that's the ideal. The ideal of life actually is that you are in the garden where you're physically secure, right? Nothing threatens you, and you have the stuff that you want. That's the Garden of Eden. And that is, of course, like the sort of traditional Jewish ideal. He says, sort of like the time in the wilderness, like that we'll begin reading about in the Torah, and I guess next week, is a version of that in the wilderness, slavery is when you're denied everything. In the wilderness, God takes care of everything. God takes the wilderness and makes it like the Garden of Eden, right? Like he gives them food, he gives them water, he gives them physical security. You're okay. So, and this point is that when you like look at this, that's sort of, these are the seeds of like the Israeli project of like caring about your own nation, or of a nationalist project caring about your own nation, meaning that the point of a state is to provide for your people and to give them security and food and jobs and homes, and that's your priority in a nation. And the trick is, what's your concern with sort of the outgroup, people outside of your nation? You'd say that nationalism is concerned for the well-being of my people, and the trick is, how do you prevent that from becoming fascism, of not being concerned for other people? Even in America, as like Hartman pointed out, I don't know, when Bernie Sanders says, I want Medicare for all, he doesn't actually mean Medicare for all. He actually means Medicare for people who live within the United States. He doesn't mean people who live in Guatemala, right? So there's a limit to one's concern because one is concerned with the nation, and you don't care for, it's not that you don't care, it's like you care less for people who are outside of that, of your boundary, right? This is the moral concern, like how much do I care for people outside? How much is my nation's mission just provide for the security, safety, and happiness of those within the border? And how much of it is that I have concern for other human beings as well? Right. So COVID sort of like brings up some of these issues of like how of like where our obligations start and stop, and does it apply elsewhere? Though by this point in time, most countries are even developing countries and poorer countries like have as many vaccines as they can use, right? Like even South Africa, by the time that variant came out, like was already turning away shipments of vaccine because there are people who don't want it, right? So, but yes, like the sort of like the obligation, the larger obligations are part of what the issues are. So like so obviously, like you've spent enough time studying Jewish texts to know that there's a strong sense of concern for the well-being of the in-group. That we don't have to emphasize, like that there's that's a thing. If you he brings in I'll go to the Isaiah who has a sense of obligation going out beyond that, right? In text number 6, in days to come, the mount of the Lord's house shall stand firm on the mountains and tower above the hills, and all the nations shall gaze on it with joy. And the many people shall go and say, come, let us go up to the mount of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that God may instruct us in his ways, that we may walk in God's paths. For instruction shall come forth from Zion, the word of God from Jerusalem. Ki mitzion tetzei Torah, dvar Adonai miYerushalayim. Then he will judge among the nations and arbitrate for the many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not take up sword against nation, neither shall they again know war. This is sort of like the double thing, which is that there's obviously this concern for the in-group, but also there's this, the reason the Torah starts where it does and why Isaiah says what he says is that there's a concern for others as well. So there's nationalism, which is to say, you have to make sure that your people are taken care of. And Judaism definitely sees, to link to the hate stuff, that concern for the in-group is a moral concern. That you in fact do have a moral obligation to look after people who are like you, to your group, that because the idea is that we all do that, and through that, everyone gets taken care of, because everyone can have an in-group. You shouldn't only care for your own group, because again, that would be horrible. That's what here again, like sort of like all the nations are of God's concern and thereby of our concern. But it is a moral decision to care for yourself and your own more. That there's something essentially sacred about that, and that sacredness is a moral concern. Because once it's gone, once we say, I just care for everyone, it's almost not the way it's essentially not the way human beings work. People have a harder time getting themselves inspired to connect with and care for people for whom they don't have a strong connection to. And ultimately, we have strong connections to certain things. For Jews, it might be fellow Jews. For Americans, it might be fellow Americans and things like this. That it might be people who look like you, who act like you, who like Star Trek like you, or whatever it might be, right? Like you have like whatever like sort of sub-interest group, and that is a moral thing. And that just to say that that everyone should be treated the same way is less so. So for those graphs out before, like the sense of a sense of in-group loyalty is seen as a moral concern in traditional Jewish thought, and that's part of why traditional Jews feel that a sense of nationalism or loyalty to the state is a moral thing, and why people react to disloyalty or perceived disloyalty to the group as a moral issue, not as not my thing. I wouldn't do it myself, but like if you want to do it, that's fine. They react to it as a moral thing. That's wrong. It's wrong to oppose the state of Israel. It's wrong to because because the in-group loyalty is seen as a moral value. All right. That's not necessarily what he had, but like that's what was on my mind, and I felt like it was linked, whether or not it was. So, but that's about an hour. So I'm going to pause. I'm going to pause at this point and say that we will